When you're thinking of Eddie Murphy movies, you're thinking of Beverly Hills Cop. I mean, of course you are, right? I mean, that's the Eddie Murphy movie of the 1980s. But I don't actually think it's his best movie of the 1980s. And I think, believe it or not, his best movie of the 1980s is one you either haven't seen or you've forgotten about. It wasn't appreciated at the time, and I'm going to tell you all about it. So back in the early 1980s, Eddie Murphy was a super duper star. He was top of the heap. People would watch Saturday Night Live just for him. And then he had a concert movie. People actually went to the movie theaters to watch a recording of a stand-up performance that he did. And it was a huge hit. I mean, it's really questionable and problematic now in its content, so don't really watch Eddie Murphy comedy stuff unless you really got the stomach for it. Whatever Eddie Murphy touched turned to gold, and that was true of Beverly Hills Cop, which was initially thought of as a more or less standard detective crime action drama and ended up being one of the top movies of the decade because he made it incredibly funny just by being him. Eddie Murphy made his next film, The Golden Child, in 1986, and it was relatively modest in its budget. I'm guessing all of it was shot in Los Angeles. Even the stuff that says it's shot, that you believe is shot in other places like Tibet or whatever, I'm guessing it was shot in Los Angeles. There are maybe 12 people in the entire cast, and other than Eddie Murphy, you're only going to recognize two of them. One of them is Charles Dance, who is a personal favorite of mine. He's made a career of calling himself the poor man's Alan Rickman. That's really not being fair to him. He is a really famous talent and fabulous guy in his own right. And you might remember him as Tywin Lannister in Game of Thrones. And he is just perfect for that kind of role. The other one is James Hong, who basically, if there's a movie in Hollywood from the last 70 years and you need an Asian person, James Hong is in it. You probably remember him recently from Everything Everywhere All at Once, where he finally won the recognition that he deserved. But otherwise, it's a cast of largely forgotten people who didn't do other films after this one, which is kind of interesting. As I said, a very modest budget in the grand scheme of things. There were a couple of very large effects shots that frankly didn't work, even by the standards of the day, and that's probably because they didn't spend enough money on them. It's surprising that they went for kind of a low budget when Eddie Murphy was such a big star, but it does work because they put a lot more effort into the story and into the performances. Here's just the basic, kind of skeleton of what it's about if you haven't seen it, or if you don't remember it. Eddie Murphy is this kind of do-gooder character. He doesn't really have a whole lot going on in his life, and he is brought into this whole world of intrigue when somebody who is basically the next cross between Gandalf and the Dalai Lama gets kidnapped. They call him the Golden Child, and Eddie Murphy has to go and find him. And hilarity ensues. He's there with a woman named Charlotte Lewis, that's the actress's name, and she does a fabulous job. I didn't realize it at the time, but when this movie was made, she was about 17 years old. She does not look it at all, but she brings a certain maturity to the role that you would just not expect from a 17-year-old, and I think that it blew me away. She is given a lot to do in this film, especially in the context of 1980s films where women tend to be more or less treated as plot devices or pretty props. There's a little bit of exploitation in the middle of this where there's a completely unnecessary dream sequence where she's kind of tied up in toilet paper. But for the most part, that's not what you get. What you get is a character who's incredibly capable. who's better at fighting off the bad guys than Eddie Murphy's character is, and who just simply does not put up with his garbage. She just does a great job of being a very competent and powerful character in her own right, which is very surprising for a 1980s film. And it was honestly very refreshing. When I watch older films, I'm generally cringing by the level of sexual harassment and objectification that's out there. And this isn't that. This, amazingly, is much better than that. The film did not perform incredibly well. It made its money. I think it made about $100 million at the time, but it was not considered a massive box office hit. Reviews were mixed. Roger Ebert liked it. A lot of critics did not. A lot of people did not like it. They were hoping for something, I don't know, more or different. But in a lot of ways, this was a very good follow-up for Beverly Hills Cop because, again, the shooting in LA, he's doing a lot of the same shtick, and there's a lot of room for Eddie Murphy to just be Eddie Murphy, which is exactly what people wanted to see at that time. Eddie Murphy famously called the movie a piece of I tend to think it is not. And I think that if you look at, especially in the context of some of the other movies that Eddie Murphy made in the 1990s and 2000s, this is actually one of the higher points in the quality of his films because they were generally fairly lowbrow affairs until you got to Dreamgirls, which was an incredibly standout role for him. Check out The Golden Child. You can find it for rent. You can find it occasionally on streaming. Give it a little bit of time. You will enjoy, if you're a fan of Los Angeles in the 80s, you'll see a lot of that great stuff, that grittiness that was just inherent at that time. You'll see a female character who is actually empowered and who doesn't have to rely on anybody else. You don't get a great description of Asian culture, but to be fair, they don't necessarily pin it to a particular Asian culture. It's this kind of generic Asian culture that they're not doing really great job of representing. So that's something. There's enough action to keep you busy. There's a banging soundtrack, which 80s movies almost always have. And of course, you got Eddie Murphy, which you can't go wrong with Eddie Murphy in his prime in the 1980s. So check out The Golden Child. I hope that you will like, subscribe, leave a comment. Tell me if you think that it's as good of a movie as I think it is, or if it should be totally forgotten.